There are more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
Well, Julia, today we get to talk about a beer that still has deep roots in beer history, but is still very present today. I find a lot of people don't love this beer, and I find other people who do love this beer. For me, there's always room for this beer in my fridge, especially around fall, especially sitting around a campfire, and that is the German smoke beers, often pronounced, as I've heard, Rauchbiers, or as most people pronounce them. As you say, Julia, how do you pronounce it?
Rauchbier.
Yep, I've heard it lots of different interesting ways. Bottom line is these are smoke beers, and back in the day, once upon a time, historically, frankly, all beers were smoke beers because in order to malt the grains, you had to use a heat source. Back then, all they had was fire. And eventually, as technology improved through the Industrial Revolution, 1700s and 1800s, now smoke beer is a novelty and not a norm. And this novelty is especially preserved in the city of Bamberg, Germany. But one thing to note on this, as we talk about this style, we're going to refer to it as it is typically a Märzen base that has used smoked grains. And we'll talk about the ingredients in a minute. But you may, as you go out and look for smoked beers, you may find different beers like a smoked Helles or even a smoked wheat beer. There are different versions of this. So a Rauchbier just means smoke beer. So you could see lots of different things. For the sake of this and the style guideline, we're going to refer to it as the kind of what you'll see most of the time is the Märzen smoked base. But that being said, Julia, tell me about the ingredients that we can expect in these beers.
I love the way you asked that because you definitely know the answer, and anyone listening can recalibrate or hear for the first time. But typical ingredients of this certainly is a very simple beer, but it is so complex. So Märzen type grist is what the beer judge certification and program guidelines call for. This is Munich and Vienna malt as the main base, maybe some Pilsner malt thrown in. And then the addition of sizable quantity of German Rauch malt is what Jeremy was alluding to. And it is that using beech wood, what then is smoking that Vienna type malt. And then as it is smoked, the air in the kilns will influence the flavor of that malt and bring it to a much more deep place than just your standard Vienna malt, which I certainly love that toasted bread crust flavors, but it gets it more to campfire, but not burnt flavors and the like. German lager yeast, so it's not a yeast-centric beer. Yeast is a definite background base note of this beer, but not in the forefront. And then traditional German or Czech hops. That's kind of it. And water, like there's your ingredients, right? And so, I mean, Jeremy's got a big collar of foam that will collapse in his Willy Becker style glass. We'll get to glassware later. I'm jumping ahead. And so why don't you talk about the visual, the appearance of what we're seeing in your glass right here?
Yeah, typically most of the beers, especially when we're talking about the Märzen style, the more common style that we see in the smoke beers, it is going to be kind of like brown to amber. And we'll talk about stats in a minute, but it should be very clear. We're not going to see particulate. It hasn't been aged in oak. This should be a very clear beer. They have just a great big head. I poured this quite aggressively because I wanted to see this head and how long it lasts. And it is like cappuccino foam just sitting there for days on end. It's very dense. Tan colored is pretty typical. And that just is a testament to the ingredients that went into it. It just yeah, if you look at this from afar, you could easily mistake it for something else. But when you get a little bit closer, then you start realizing that this is something special. And I think that really has to do with the aroma, which I believe you're going to talk about next while I sniff away.
Well, you sniff away and enjoy it. And aroma, I liken it to when you're traveling and or walking in your town or neighborhood 2 blocks away from a barbecue joint, and you haven't reached the joint yet. And then as you get there, a block away, a half block away, you start to smell the alderwood, the beechwood, the oak, the cherry wood, whatever they're using to do their barbecue and smoke pit. And that's the essence of what you're going to get in this aroma, is not just a malt, a malty aroma that's rich and bready, toasted bread crust, the edge of that pizza from a brick oven, but you're also going to get some of that campfire or think smoked bacon type of flavors or aromas, forgive me. And then you're going to get lager fermentation character, maybe a snatch of sulfur that goes away quickly. Very, very low floral hop, herbal, spicy German noble hops are allowed, but not often present. And then caramel sweet, biscuity dry, roasted malt is too much, right? It's not going to go there. The ethanol is a variable. You've got some alcohol there to potentially detect, also a little prickle of the carbonation. And you've just pretty much got the malt carrying the day, being the smoked malt. And that's aroma in a nutshell. And then what does that lead us to taste as you're tasting?
Well, luckily, the aroma makes a promise, and the taste delivers on that promise most of the time. And as I smell this glass, it just smells like wood-fired barbecued pork belly. I mean, and that's kind of what these beers can be. And I mean that in the best way possible. But when we start talking about flavor, this is a tough beer to judge and kind of dive through because the smoke is usually dominant. It can be low to high, can be subtle to dominant, but it's a pretty dominant aroma and flavor. But the thing that distinguishes this amongst a couple other smoke beers that we'll talk about another time, this one tends to be a little bit on the meaty side. It's perfectly okay to think barbecue, to think bacon, and that is a typical of the Rauchbier. As you kind of put the smokiness to the side, you have a medium to dry finish. There's a medium bitterness, but everything is in balance. You can detect no hops whatsoever from the flavor of the hops all the way to medium hop flavor. But everything kind of chimes together like just a well-aged stew that's been going for days. You mentioned that it is a lager, so there should be a clean fermentation with all the flavor and aroma that's going on. Fermentation should not rear its head at all. If it does, then that's most likely a bad example. But like I mentioned, it is balanced. It's never harsh. It's never bitter. It's never burnt. It should never be rubbery or sulfury or charred or any of these flavors that we would associate with something that has been smoked. It should just be absolutely delightful, but then we've talked about aroma and flavor. The third kind of leg of that three-legged flavor scale would be mouthfeel, right?
Yeah, and real quick to clarify, and I mean, perception is personal, so is description. Jeremy's job is to describe what he's trying as one of the classic examples, but our job is also to talk about the style guidelines. The style guidelines allow for a bitterness that is moderate. So I feel like it's important to jump in and say, when you're definitively saying never bitter, you're talking about maybe that one example. But the guidelines allow for moderate hop bitterness. We also allow, for low to none hop flavor. So it's okay to have hops, but very low level based on the guidelines. And
Thank you. I think I misspoke, and I was referring to it should never have like a harshness to it. And
exactly
so thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, and everything's on a spectrum, right? What is bitter on the spectrum of your definition of it compared to somebody else's. And then with mouthfeel, you talked about a little bit of dryness. Fully attenuated is what the style guidelines will call for. That means the yeast fully ate most available sugars. I think that's a little bit of a tricky word to use. Fully is too definitive in my taste for the guidelines. If I were to update them, I would modify that, because that would mean there is no residual sugar left in this beer, and that's clearly not the case. So it's drier, mostly attenuated, and then you have no sweeter cloying impression. You do have a sense on Jeremy's description of it where ethanol is slightly warming. You do have a chance to have that opportunity to get alcohol. So in everything that Jeremy said, it's his personal way of describing it, but I'm going to keep us true to the guidelines. So we're all studying from the same script and Bible. And that's important to mention, is that there is a slight warmth if you're really paying attention from that ethanol. But the strength is hidden. It's not really about getting that ethanol. And then medium carbonation. This is a classically carbonated German style beer that's not a Hefeweizen, that's not a Belgian style level of carbonation, 2.5 to 2.7 volumes of CO2, and a bit of a creamy texture because of the carbonation and some of that residual sugar that's left over. And that would then lead us to style comparison. What other styles come to mind?
So this one's kind of easy, because if we're comparing this Rauchbier, it really is comparison. It's compared to its base style. This happens to be a Märzen Rauchbier, so we compare it to a Märzen. If there was a Helles style, then we'd have to compare it to the Helles. And really, it's that same base beer, but with a meaty smokiness added to it, just to kind of keep it simple. Now, the other smoke beers that we will talk about eventually in a different episode, one would be the Grodziskie, and that is a different wood, a different smoke. That beer should not be meaty. It should just be very dry, clean smoke. This should be very meaty, and it's almost like you can imagine the grease when you taste this beer. And the other one would be a Lichtenhainer, a smoky sour, and that's it's a very clean smoke. This one is very, very, very unique, because meaty is just the best word we can say for this. So when you think about that meaty smokiness, add it to a base flavor, there's your comparison.
And I would almost bring it to umami, like a umami elicits one of the basic tastes. You have sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami, and umami is elicited, I would imagine, and coaxed out by the residual sugar and the phenolic essence of that smoke, that beechwood smoked malt.
Yeah. So take us away on the commercial examples. What if we were to go out here and try and find a beer like this to study or to taste? What would we be looking for?
So the easy cheat from the domestic side in the States over here is really look for, and Jeremy, if you can show the example that you have again from Bamberg with the bottle, you're looking to calibrate with the Karla, if I'm even saying it closely, remotely right, which it says Erbach, it's really a Marzen. And you've got other examples in the world, never mind from Bamberg, but you're looking for anything that says Rauchbier on the label. And if it says Bamberg, you're in the right spot. There's Gauler, there's Rittmeyer, there's numerous amounts that are starting to come from the United States craft brewer world, as well as other emerging beer countries that would mimic this. But your best classic examples have come from Bamberg, and they are professing to be a Marzen style Rauchbier.
Yeah, and even amongst craft breweries, I don't see a lot of these out there. I've brewed a few of these myself, or smoky beers myself. One of my favorite smoky beer joints is in Austin near the airport at Live Oak, and you can, if a little shout out to Live Oak, if you're looking for some really good smoke beer, then when in Austin, do as the Austintonians do. That being said, let's we've talked all about the romance of this beer. Let's talk about some numbers real quick.
Yeah, so go with it, Jeremy. Take us through.
Yeah,
stats.
with the per the 2021 guidelines, this is not a terribly strong beer. It's in that moderate range. The moderate range being from 4 to 6. This is up the upper end, so 4.8 to 6. That really just puts it in my mind from a 5 to 6%. That's kind of what you can expect. If you were to find some craft beer versions that are a little bit different, then great. This is not an exact science. These are not rules that we follow. These are just descriptions of the most common examples. And we talked about the bitterness. You can have no to a moderate bitterness, but it should never be harsh. But this can actually be from like 20 to 30 IBUs. So it should be present, but it should not be dominant. The malt and the smoke flavor should be dominant. The bitterness is there just to keep the malty train from running away. SRM, we are talking from 12 to 22. So we are getting into kind of amber to kind of like a lighter brown color. And if you can see in mine, there is a little bit of like amber, almost copper highlights to this particular example that's in my glass. When we get to original gravity, is just a great way to kind of keep an idea about what the ABV is going to be, as long as everything attenuates just right. But we're looking at 1050 to 1057. That's kind of a tight range of specs there that most examples kind of cater to. What's even more interesting, and Julia brings this up all the time, is the final gravity. On this one, we can expect 1012 to 1016. Again, a really tight range, but more importantly to me, that just tells me that there's some body to this beer. This is not going to be wispy and dry. It's going to have a little bit of oomph, and it's going to be great with food when we finally start talking about that. And you mentioned a moderate carbonation. That's still, as far as I can tell, all the samples out there, normal carbonation is 2 to 2.5. This is right about there as well. So it should kind of fit in those specs. But let's get back to, you mentioned that I'm drinking this out of a Willy Becker right now. Let's talk about the glassware and what you would drink it out of.
And I will point out in everything Jeremy just said too, the Urbach version that Jeremy's drinking is a little bit more robust than the same brewery who makes a Marzen version. Mm-hmm. So just keep that in mind. It's a little richer, a little bit more Bach-like. And then in terms of glassware, they both would go very well in that Willy Becker that you have. Even Cicerone recommends in their workbooks the Willy Becker. And then you also have, your typical Munich Stein. I'm drinking water out of my half-liter, not necessarily full Stein version. That's Spaten, dimpled mug is a perfect example, but half-liter or liter. And those are super fun. Plus the beers with the glassware with the handle allows you to drink and manage your beer a little better. So I love that.
Yes. I love a beer that I can hold the beer and hold my keys at the same time, just kind of, or, fiddle with my watch or phone, there's plenty of options there. But one of the best parts though, we've talked about the glassware. This beer for me, is fantastic for pairing with food. And, I think the number one thing that I've heard from people who have been there and traveled there is you've got to have a Rauchbier with the Bamberg onion, which is, as I understand it, is basically like a soup topped with onion and cheese, and it just goes together perfectly. I'm not a huge fan of onions, but when I get there, I will definitely try that. What would you pair with this beer that would be kind of unexpected for someone?
Well, a lot of it's unexpected if you go to the source of the brewery in Bamberg. And on that onion, which I've only read about, Jeremy, I've never had, they're supposedly filling this onion with minced pork and bacon and mashed potatoes and then a smoked beer sauce using the beer. So that's like, everything that you would want to find with some synergies, hooks, bridges, links, parallels to what's going on in any one of their smoked beers. They've also got, roasted leg of pork. So you certainly, if you're on the meat carnivore train, you're in a right lane here, because that beer is going to go so well with grilled, roasted, and smoked proteins, particularly meat. I mean, any kind of German sausage that are smoked for sure. And then they serve it with cabbage, which to me is really just a black backdrop for other flavor around it, right? And you've got potato dumplings and your classic German dishes, brisket. I would go with all of that. And so I would stay in that lane. And if not, breakfast with this beer is a beautiful waker-upper. So you're going to get some sustenance to start your day. And I would serve it with some greasy fried eggs. that maybe have been sprinkled with some herbs that can try to act and mimic like German hops, herbs that maybe a little bit of mint on top of those eggs. I would love to try that, and just some toast with butter on top.
Yeah, I think this seems to be, especially with the grilled meats, even grilled veggies, I love the idea of using the cancellation effect to your advantage. And if you have some smoked meat, some smoked grills, so you have this domination of smoke flavors, I've experienced that where that can actually kind of move to the background, and what you taste is just more of the malt and more of the food. But along that too, I think about, I could even use this with dessert with like kind of like a cheesecake type of thing, or maybe some like grilled cantaloupe or manchego or camembert cheese. I mean, it's just you could do a lot with this. You could really play around with this beer and have some real good culinary fun.
Yeah, I love it. And like does calm like is the way I say it on your canceling notion. So if you had something with smoke or essence of that kind of barbecue flavor, it's going to lessen the smoke intensity of your beer, and then the other flavors around both the food and the beverage will shine even brighter.
Yeah. Well, that's it for our German smoke beers. If you've never tried one, go get one and try it. If you're not a fan of them, try them again, but try them with food. It's a completely different experience with food. But thank you again for listening to this. And this is a fun beer.
Yeah, and stay tuned for a total other episode, a Stylecast from us as Sense of Beer Style hosts and your guides on smoke beers. That is not this style. This is particularly specifically Rauchbier, inspired by these beers from Bamberg, Germany. So stay tuned for smoke beer episode.
Awesome. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
and me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.